year of the fire day?
1912. The explosive bank robbery was 1909.
Lots of things happened.
Well, good evening. This talk is about the very beginning of Minocqua. I'm not going to be going too far into the early history. Primarily, the construction of the railroad to Minocqua, coming onto the island, and then about the first 10 years of Minocqua's history. There was more to cover in that period of time than I thought we had time for, so I haven't covered everything that I could have. So we've got, let's look at the Minocqua Island. Prior to the construction of this railroad, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul to the Minocqua Island, there were no settlements in this area. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul decided in 1886 to extend their valley line, which is shown here. It started at Toma from the main line of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. It branched off and then went up along the Wisconsin River Valley and ended at Merrill in the 1870s. Now in 1886, Merrill it reached, I think, in 1881. So in 1886, they decided to extend it to Minocqua. That was another 54 miles. At that time, this area was unsettled. There had been one railroad built up into the North Woods. This was by the Wisconsin Central Railway. Started from Neenah and went to Ashland so that they had access to Lake Superior boat traffic at Ashland. This construction of the Wisconsin Central Railroad led to the establishment of towns west of us, like Fifield, Park Falls, Phillips. Those towns existed before Minocqua. Then in 1882, the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad did an extension of its line that had been going to Wausau from Appleton and Green Bay. So they started building their line north. Their plan was to get into upper Michigan and to the mining country in Michigan. In 1882, they got as far as Monaco and then built a spur to the Wisconsin River, which is where Boone Lake is now and where Rhinelander was established in 1882. In 1883, they continued north through what became Eagle River. So Eagle River was established in 1883 before Minocqua existed. So at that time, this central area really was unsettled. This is the Tomahawk River and Minocqua. So we had settlements to the east of us and to the west of us when the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul started building its line now from Merrill north to Minocqua. They surveyed that line in the summer of 1886, and then summer and fall of 86, and then in the spring of 87, they started the construction from Merrill north. They thought they would reach Minocqua by November, but ran into problems with the line, with building it. Now, why did they plan to end the railroad here? Because this is as far as it went. And, Minocqua, which is called an island city, although it really isn't, it is on a narrow peninsula here, or an isthmus. But they did plan to end the initial stage of this railroad here on the island. Their long-term plan was to continue north with it into the UP. The UP had a lot of mining going on, so that was a profitable destination for railroads to be headed. As far as I can tell, the railroad figured this was an excellent place to end this first stage, the first extension of the line, because of the large Tomahawk Lakes chain. And initially, when Minocqua didn't exist, this entire chain was called Tomahawk Lakes. And they assumed that with all the pines up here and all the logging that would be going on, there would be a sawmill built here at the end of its line, probably right here in proximity to the Minocqua Island. Curiously, that never happened. I never heard of any reason why it didn't happen, but it didn't. I mean, and 2 years after Minocqua was established, a sawmill was built at Hazelhurst. 3 years after Minocqua was established, a sawmill was built at the very eastern end of Lake Tomahawk. And 4 years after Minocqua was established, there was a sawmill on Big River Viaduct, but never one on Minocqua, aside from a small one that was built here, but it was a small scale sawmill. Now, during the railroad construction, there were railroad construction camps every few miles along the line. The northernmost camp was here, where the Northern Resort was eventually built. So on this point, across from what would become the village of Minocqua, there was a railroad construction camp. And that consisted almost entirely of tents. There was one log building there that was a saloon. There also was a general store built a little south of the camp. Camp was on this point, where this is an area 1928 aerial photo of Northern Resort. So this is where the construction camp was. An 1851 survey of the Indian reservation showed that in their notes that there was a log cabin here along the thoroughfare. And understand that this picture in 28 is of course long after the Minocqua Dam was built. The Minocqua Dam raised the level of the Minocqua chain of lakes by 4 or 5 feet. So in 1851, when the surveyors were here, this was more like just a little stream. Because if you remove 4 or 5 feet of water from this area where boats go underneath the Bearskin Trail, there'd be very little water there. That's about how deep it is. So this was mostly just a stream between the two lakes. Incidentally, that's really how the thoroughfare between Lake Minocqua and the Tomahawk Lake was before the construction of the dam. That was more of a stream than a thoroughfare that you could certainly run it in a canoe, but you would not have used a motorboat on it. That 1851 survey also said that there was a log cabin on this side of the thoroughfare, and that was from American Fur Trading Company. And then on this side here, here we've got the thoroughfare. We're looking from an entirely different direction now towards Minocqua. But along this shoreline here, there was an Indian village in 1851, and the survey notes state that the name of the Indian village was Minocqua. And that undoubtedly was the source of the name of Minocqua. There is controversy about the source of the name Minocqua, but in my opinion, that certainly is the closest that you're going to come to the name Minocqua. Now, when the government did the survey in 1862, the sectional survey of this area, they were defining the section boundaries. That survey again noted that there was an Indian village here on the north side of the thoroughfare, but they did not make note of any log cabin here. But they did note a log cabin on the island, so to speak, about where the Aqua Bowl is now. In 1886, Gus Nolan, who was the man who eventually homesteaded this property and started the Northern Resort. He started the resort in 1900. He was here in 1886 to survey the eastern and southern boundaries of the reservation because of the impending construction of railroads here. Not only the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul to Minocqua, but also the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railroad was going to be constructed from Rhinelander through what would become Woodruff. So they were surveying the boundaries of, or he was in charge of a crew surveying the boundaries of the reservation. And he said that when he was here, the Indian village was no longer at this site. It was across the lake, about where the parking lot for the Campanile Center is now. And of course the island was covered with pine trees, was very well wooded. But the the Chippewa Indians had moved their village there. Now the story that he heard was that in the 1850s, a band of Sioux Indians had moved into this area to challenge the Chippewa to take this over. And they had a battle in this area around the thoroughfare. And the Chippewas drove off the Sioux, and there were deaths. And then later in the 1860s, around 1870, there was an epidemic here, probably smallpox, that was killing some of the Indians. And the Indians felt that it was the evil spirits of the Sioux Indians who were killed in that battle that were in essence poisoning this site. And so that's when they moved their village across the lake. And then when Cap Ray came here, Stiles W. Ray, nicknamed Cap Ray, he was here before Minocqua existed. And he saw the Indian village on this shore, and the island was covered with trees. But then the Indians were moved off back on the reservation, because they were off the reservation here, of course, and they were moved off the Minocqua site in the summer of 1887. They had to move back onto the reservation. So I mentioned that the railroad reached Minocqua later than was planned. The southern half of the route, they figured that the route from Merrill to Minocqua would be very easy. I mean, it's flat, it's just sand. They didn't have to deal with blasting through rock, but what they ran into, especially on the northern half of the route, not the southern half so much, they completed the southern half to Tomahawk. Well, that wouldn't be half, but they were in Tomahawk by about September 1 with a completed railroad. And Tomahawk too was created like Minocqua because the railroad came through. And but beyond Tomahawk, and especially getting up into the Harshaw area, Cashin, and into Minocqua, they ran into so many swampy areas like the one depicted on this photo. I don't know that this photo was actually taken of the construction of the line between Merrill and Minocqua, because I have some doubts about the timing, because this could be a December photo, I suppose. They were still working on it, but they would have been way beyond this in construction of the line in December. So I don't know when we would have seen winter weather like this, because they started in the spring of '87. The rails were laid into Minocqua by early December of 1887. So I really can't vouch for this photo actually being of the work on the line between Merrill and Minocqua, but it is illustrative of what they were doing. I mean, it was all horses, and they were using scrapers to scrape dirt through. It was not mechanized. There were 900 men working on the line between Merrill and Minocqua. They were getting paid $1.75 a day. They stayed, like I say, every few miles. They had construction camps. In the summer, in June, the contractor who was in charge of building the line had to increase the wages to $2 a day because the mosquitoes were so bad. The men said they're not going to work under these conditions for $1.75 a day. So, in crossing a low area like this, they would bring dirt on rail cars. I mean, they would lay these rails temporarily to bring dirt and dump it. That's actually that's a dump cart like we're talking about that they rolled out on rails. So that's how it was built. And then this is a good picture that illustrates the problems that they had in the early few years, where they filled all these low areas, these swampy areas. The fill kept sinking, and this was typical. I mean, you can see it sinking here, and it's twisting the rail, not twisting, but curving the rail down into the low area, and that made it difficult for the railroad to trains in the first few years. They had to go slow. Otherwise, they would be running their train off the tracks. They did reach Hazelhurst by November 1, but then they hit this swamp, the Kawaga-Saga swamp. And that was their big hang-up. That delayed them a long time. They kept bringing in loads of fill to make a filled line through there, and the fill kept sinking. I won't go into more detail about that event or about that problem. That's in a different talk about that goes into more detail about the construction of the railroad. Thank you for reminding me that I meant to turn mine on. So they ran into a lot of trouble. This delayed them. They gave up trying to make a fill across this, and they made a trestle. They drove pilings all the way through this low area. They drove pilings and made a trestle. The trestle like this. Now this is a trestle across Lake Minocqua. If you were here a month ago for the bridges talk, I talked more about this being one of the bridges, and the fact that initially when the railroad was built into Minocqua, there was no fill across Lake Minocqua like there is now. Over what, 2/3 of the distance probably is now on a fill. Initially they built a trestle all the way across. It looked like that. Now, there is no record. Well, this is the kind of bridge. There was a pass-through truss bridge on this end of the trestle into Minocqua. That too was replaced. When they filled this about 2/3 of the way, in about 1900, they also replaced this bridge with a steel bridge. Okay, I got one picture ahead here, so let me finish talking about the construction of the railroad into Minocqua. It is clear that they did lay the rails onto the island of Minocqua across that trestle during the first half of December. There's a report that was in either a Merrill or Wausau paper about a man named either James Murphy or Jerry Murphy, depending on which article you read, that was in the crew of men who had to push the rail cars, across the trestle into Minocqua. Because at that time, in early December, the trestle was not braced sufficiently to support a locomotive. And they wanted to have train cars go into Minocqua. Maybe they wanted to move things into Minocqua, but they also wanted to be able to report to their board of directors, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul board of directors, for the close of 1887, that the line to Minocqua was completed. It really wasn't. They couldn't run a locomotive into the town yet, but the line into Minocqua was completed. So, interestingly about this employee, he was in the crew. They would push the railroad cars across that trestle into Minocqua. He fell, and the wheels of a rail car ran over his legs, and they were mangled. So the railroad sent a special train up from Merrill. They sent the train up, and to bring him back to Merrill. So they had doctors ready for him in Merrill. But when he got to Merrill, the doctors discovered that nobody was going to be responsible for paying for his medical treatment, not even the railroad. And there was no workers' compensation back then. That began in 1911. In fact, Wisconsin, I believe, was the first state in the country to establish a workers' comp law. So anyway, nobody would be responsible for his care. So they took him to the poorhouse instead. And he died the next day. So it was tough times back then. Now the first real train to pull into Minocqua, we do know, happened on January 24, 1888. All right, right, so the picture that I've had up here is John Mann. He was coming to Minocqua before Minocqua existed. He was a fishing guy. And fishermen, while we had Minelander existed, Eagle River in particular, Eagle River was a destination for fishermen. They would come from Eagle River and want to travel out to the outer lakes for the best fishing. They wanted to go where it was said you could walk on the backs of the fish. You didn't need a boat. And so he was involved in bringing fishermen to the Minocqua chain in 1886. And he decided that it would be a good idea to build a fishing resort on Lake Minocqua. So he did that because this is how people were camping on the lake up until then. Of course, coming that far, they had to camp here. It wasn't a one-day trip. So he built a fishing resort on right here. And so it was, in this photograph, we're looking down the trestle to the west at the shore of Minocqua. His log resort was right here. And he ran that I'm sure he located it here knowing that the railroad was going to be coming through because that line had been surveyed in 1886. He built this fishing resort in the fall of '86 and anticipated that would be along the rail line. And then he had guests there in '87 and '88. Problem for him, though, was that he didn't own the land that his resort was on. Now, this picture shows the log part. Ignore this for now. That really comes later in the story. But this is a partial view of the log building that John Mann built as a fishing resort. He ran it only those first 2 years and then moved out to Trout Lake in the fall, or after 1888 season. In the fall of '88, he moved up to Trout Lake and he built a resort up there that you'd be familiar with. It became Cardinal's Lodge in later years. So he's the one who started that resort on Trout Lake, on the west shore of Trout Lake. Primarily, I'm sure, because his future was pretty dicey here. He didn't own the land. So he moved up, but it was also told in later years that he felt too crowded down here. After the railroad came and the town started being built, it wasn't the atmosphere that he was looking for. He wanted to be out in the wild. He wanted a more wild surrounding. So that, I'm sure, was a big factor in him moving up to Trout Lake, where it was still wild. So when he moved out, M.C. Wetmore bought his building from him. Actually, bought his building from his partner, Nichols. Because Mann had a partner named Nichols when he built this, and this gives more of a view of that, the log building. So M.C. Wetmore from St. Louis bought the building. Of course, he couldn't buy the land from Mann. Mann didn't own it. He couldn't buy the land from anybody because this land was water reserve land. Now, I referred to water reserve land in last month's talk. That in itself is a whole subject, of the whole talk. The water reserve lands, we had them all around the waterways up here in this area, and they were not available for homesteading until 1890. They became available. So M.C. Wetmore just bought the building, and he built a cottage here. He figured, he was chairman of the National Democratic Party. He was well connected politically. He figured that, I'm sure, not that I read this anywhere, I'm assuming, he figured he had enough connections that when this land did become available, he was going to be able to get it. Well, that turned out not to happen because when the water reserve lands, when Congress passed an act opening up the water reserve lands, and they were going to be opened on December 10, 1890, they were not available to anybody who had settled on the land or built anything on the land prior to December 10, 1890. So he was shut out. But he nevertheless had this nice cottage, and he fixed this up. This looks different from the way it did when John Mann had it. Now, I mentioned to you that Wetmore was head of the National Democratic Party, and we actually had a Democratic presidential candidate give a speech here in Minocqua during that campaign, the 1900 campaign. William Jennings Bryan, actually a rather famous Democratic candidate, never became president, but he was Democrat, and with Wetmore being president or head of the National Democratic Party, Wetmore invited him to come and have a vacation in Minocqua at his cottage. I have always suspected, but it may not be true, I've always wondered, I guess I should say, whether this picture was taken in anticipation of William Jennings Bryan's arrival here, because of the bunting and the flags. But if there was my thought is, if there was a photographer here to take this picture, there should have been a photographer here to take the picture with William Jennings Bryan in it too, and that never happened. There's no photo of William Jennings Bryan up here. So this was probably some other event. So the myth is that William Jennings Bryan stayed in the Northern Resort, and I'll show why that myth arose in later years. This is actually where William Jennings Bryan stayed. M.C. Wetmore owned this extra cottage, which is to the south of the Star Cottage that has been pictured so far. This is called the Fern Cottage. It was his housekeeper's cottage, but that's where William Jennings Bryan and his party stayed. And over here to the left is where the Northern Resort is. And there is the Northern Resort. Now, Northern Resort just happened to open the same month that William Jennings Bryan visited Minocqua. And the myth is that William Jennings Bryan was a guest at the Northern Resort, perhaps the first guest, because he did sign the register. This is a photocopy of the register from the Northern Resort. Here it is for June 17, 1900. Top of the page, signature by William Jennings Bryan of Lincoln, Nebraska, and the rest of his party. In reality, what they did, and this was described in the Minocqua Times at the time, they went to the Northern Resort on that day for lunch. and so he and everybody in his party signed the register in the morning. But they didn't stay there. While he was here, he didn't intend to give a speech, but the people in Minocqua were so excited to have him here, they convinced him to do in reality, a stump speech. He didn't actually stand on the stump here. But when he did tour logging camps in the area, and it gave actual stump speeches, standing on stumps. But they set up a speaker's platform right here behind the Aqua Bowl. This is where the parking lot for Campanile is. They set up a speaker's platform here. At that time, in June of 1900, this was mostly vacant. There weren't many buildings here. And so there was room for a lot of people to stand and hear him talk. The report was that 4,000 people came to hear his speech. I find that hard to believe, but I think it's very likely that there were 1,000 people here to hear him talk. The trains, the railroad ran special trains up for people to hear him talk. So, whether it was 1,000 or 4,000, there were special trains bringing people up just to hear his speech, and that's where he did it. That's June of 1900. To my knowledge, it's the only time in our history, that in the Minocqua's history, that a presidential candidate gave a speech in Minocqua. So we also have a second cottage. Now, again, if you were at last month's talk, you maybe remember Darrow and Darrowville. It's just across the railroad tracks. This is Wetmore's. This is Darrow's, Page Darrow. Now, Darrow was a rich man from Chicago. At about the same time that Wetmore built this cottage, Darrow built this one. These are the first two cottages built on Lake Minocqua. They're not the first cottages on the Tomahawk chain, excuse me, because there were some fishing lodges built on Lake Tomahawk prior to this. There was nothing up on what we now call Lake Minocqua or Coagasaka. So these were the first cottages built on Lake Minocqua.